Welcome and good evening to this lecture event sponsored by Cultural Affairs and Global Studies here at Orange County Community College. I am Cultural Affairs Coordinator Dorothy Sheff. It is nice to see you at this important lecture on Ukraine. Cultural Affairs offers lectures, masterclasses, films, concerts, exhibits throughout the year. With COVID restrictions lessening, I hope you'll return to our campuses for live events, as well as continuing to attend through Zoom. This evening, our expert on Eastern Europe and Eastern European history, Dr. Michael Strmiska, will speak to you on the crisis in Ukraine in historical perspective. Michael Strmiska has taught in Latvia, Lithuania, and Croatia, and the Czech Republic, and he also continues to do that through Zoom. He has personal knowledge, and he will give you that this evening and his perspective from himself and from history. And I thank you very much for attending, Dr. Strmiska.
Thank you, Dorothy. Okay, so welcome to this lecture on Ukraine. It is my pleasure to be with you, although it is a very painful time we're in. I hope I can shed some light on some aspects of the history of Ukraine for you to better put the current situation in perspective. Let me start by making a statement about why Ukrainian history matters. Vladimir Putin's vicious, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has made clear his moral bankruptcy. His understanding of history is similarly defective. Putin has made the claim, now amplified by Russian propaganda, that there was no Ukrainian nation before the USSR, the Soviet Union, and that therefore Ukraine should again be part of Russia. In point of fact, Ukraine has existed as a social, cultural, and political entity for many centuries in a variety of forms, long before there was any Soviet Union or Vladimir Putin. So, Ukraine has existed in a variety of forms long before there was any Soviet Union or Vladimir Putin. On top of that, the modern nation of Ukraine has been a legitimate, internationally recognized sovereign country since 1991. We must reject Professor Putin's false narrative of Ukrainian history. And so I welcome you to this quick 1-hour tour of Ukraine's complicated and colorful history. And hold on, the slide is not advancing. There we go. So here you can see the many different configurations of Ukraine that have existed over a long period of time. From 800 CE up to the present, there have been all these different forms of Ukraine. So let me start with a question that some of you might have. Which came first, Ukraine or Russia? Well, in a sense, it's a tricky question. Both Ukraine and Russia trace their beginnings to the medieval nation of Kievan, or sometimes Kievan Rus, whose name alone has obvious Ukrainian and Russian associations. However, Russia as we now know it developed from Moscow or Muscovy, which was only a small town in the 12th century when Kiev had been a large and powerful city for centuries. If we define Ukraine as Kiev-centered and Russia as Moscow-centered, then Ukraine is much older, but the history is complicated. Another common question, is Ukrainian just a dialect of Russian? No. They are related languages, but they are distinct. Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian are the East Slavic subgroup of the Slavic branch of the larger Indo-European language tree. And here you see the 3 Slavic subgroups. Eastern Slavic languages, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Western Slavic, Czech, Polish, Slovakian, Southern Slavic, Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, Slovenian. And here is an image of zeroing in on the part of the Indo-European language tree that includes the Slavic group. And you'll notice if you look at that Slavic branch, that Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian are grouped together. So going into the history, by about 700 CE, Eastern Slavs dominated this area of Eastern Europe, which is in and around what today we know as Ukraine. By the year 900, a powerful Eastern Slavic state, Kievan Rus, had arisen. And Kievan Rus is actually the ancestor of both Ukraine and Russia. Both Ukraine and Russia trace their roots back to this state. And a couple of questions and answers here. Where is Kiev or Kiev on this map? Well, it's pretty much dead center right here. Where is Moscow? Let's see. Well, guess what? It's not there at all because Moscow does not exist prior to the 12th century. It's another way of saying Kiev, much older. And let me mention another interesting variation on this early history, another complication. Kievan Rus had a rival, a kingdom called Khazaria, that is a very interesting early state. It was formed by Central Asian people known as the Khazars, who came from the east, from Central Asia. They may in fact have been the founders of Kiev, because when we look at maps of the earlier area of Khazaria, we find that Kiev is right on its western perimeter. However, there are legends that speak of Kiev's founding in 482, which would be much, much earlier. An interesting point about Khazaria, or the Khazar kingdom, is that the Khazar rulers made the decision to convert to Judaism around the year 800. So for a time, Eastern Europe was actually home to a powerful Jewish kingdom. But the rise of Kievan Rus, which we see here to the left, to the west, and north of Khazaria, caused a decline of Khazaria. And by about the year 1000, it was pretty much gone. Here's another view of the situation. The green area here, dark green, this is what becomes Kievan Rus. And these circles, or this major circle here, shows you the area of the Khazar Khaganate, or the Khazar kingdom. And obviously they overlap. So there was this interesting interaction between the Slavs of Kievan Rus and the Khazar people from Central Asia. Now, how did Kievan Rus first develop? Well, here we have to discuss a people known as the Varangians. Kievan Rus developed out of a partnership between two different groups, Eastern Slavs, who were living in different tribes in the area of Kievan Rus and beyond, and a Scandinavian Viking people, probably originally from Sweden, known as the Varangian Rus. And they were doing trading in Eastern Europe, traveling down toward Constantinople. The story we have, the narrative that's been passed on, is that the Eastern Slavs and some other groups living in the area were constantly squabbling with each other. And they appealed to these Varangian Rus Vikings to provide leadership and stability. In other words, to be almost like appointed executive officers for them. And so was born Kievan Rus, the Rus word coming actually from these Vikings, these Varangian Rus. And it was an interesting state because the population was mainly Slavic, but the rulers for the first few generations, at least, were these Varangian Vikings. The first of them the king Rurik, who began the Rurikid dynasty. The first capital of Kievan Rus was not Kiev, it was Novgorod, further to the north, and later Kiev became the capital. Kievan Rus was a patchwork of principalities, little mini states or mini kingdoms ruled by different princes under the authority of the Grand Prince of Kiev. And here on this map, you can see how complicated Kievan Rus was. You have all these different principalities. Here's Novgorod, here's Polotsk, and here it's written as Kiev, but the Ukrainian way to write it is Kiev. Here's a painting giving a romantic version of the meeting of the Slavs and the Varangians that leads to the foundation of Kievan Rus. And to give a quick snapshot of the further history, first of all, around 862 is when the state first forms under the leadership of Rurik. Then a major milestone is in the year 998 when Kievan Rus adopts, 998, Kievan Rus adopts Orthodox Christianity as its form of religion, abandoning their former Slavic paganism. Some major motivations for making this change were that they had a lot of trade ties with the Byzantine Empire, which also was the home base of Orthodox Christianity. So this religious link helped intensify their trade and cultural ties, and there was a lot of interaction between the two. By about 1100, we have Kievan Rus at the max. Kiev, among the largest cities in Europe, with glorious Orthodox churches. By 1150, internal divisions between all those different principalities weakened Kievan Rus. And then 1240, Mongols, and the Mongols in this part of Europe are often called Tatars. They undertake a siege of Kiev that results in the destruction of much of the city and the end of the state of Kievan Rus. But the city of Kiev will soon revive. So here you see Kievan Rus in the larger picture of the time. Now this is from around 1200, and here we see Kiev and the state around Kiev. And now on this map, you can see Moscow beginning to emerge, but it's a very small principality at this time. And this map shows you the Mongol or Tatar invasion that destroyed Kiev. And here we see Kiev over here. The Mongols smash it in around 1222. Massive destruction to Kiev. Then we go into a new phase of the history of the region. And first, Kiev is rebuilt and becomes the center of a new Ukrainian principality or kingdom that combines actually two different regions, Galicia and Volhynia. And this kingdom or principality is also known as Ruthenia. However, it's not fully independent. It's a subordinate vassal state to the Mongol Empire. Then a bit later in time, 1323, we have a rising power, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is becoming larger and more powerful at this time. And an interesting point is that Lithuania was never conquered by the Mongols. They managed to fend them off through diplomacy and some battles and other means. But now Lithuania is emerging as a big power, and it absorbs much of Ukraine. Then in 1386, Lithuania enters an alliance with Poland, and in doing this, it takes on the Catholic religion, and from this point, Polish influence over both Lithuania and the Ukrainian lands that are controlled by Lithuania. Then, a bit later in time, the partnership between Poland and Lithuania becomes even closer and they form a joint state known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which I will refer to as the PLC. And at this point, Poland is definitely dominating Ukraine. Now, going back in time a little bit prior to this point, at 1480, Muscovy or Moscow breaks free, gains independence in battle from the Mongols and the Tatars, and now Muscovy or Moscow starts to become an important state. It becomes the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and that is the seed of the future Russia. And then over the next couple centuries, we see Moscow fighting against Lithuania and or Poland as they're all trying to expand in Eastern Europe. And in particular, they're fighting for control of the areas we know today as Belarus and Ukraine. Okay, so on this map, you can see on the left side, you can see the kingdom of Galicia, Volhynia. You see this green area here. And then on this map, you see the Grand Duchy of Lithuania absorbing this territory. In its first couple of centuries, the Kingdom of Poland was actually smaller than the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which also contained Ukraine originally. Only after their 1386 alliance did Poland grow larger by taking in former Lithuanian lands, including much of Ukraine. So there's a lot of jockeying and trading of territory back and forth and competition for territory, and the boundaries keep shifting in this period. So here you see the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at its maximum extent. And we see that in 1434, and this is all, it already is in an alliance with Poland, but it has a large degree of independence, so it controls this territory on its own. And at this point, the GDL contains modern-day Lithuania and Belarus and Ukraine. And then, as I said, in 1569, Poland and Lithuania team up to make the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here we see it at its maximum extent in the 17th century. It contains not only Poland and Lithuania, but modern-day Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, some bits of Western Russia, also some bits of Estonia, and it was in fact the largest state in all of Europe at this time. I mentioned that Moscow grows from being something very small to something progressively much larger and more powerful. And we can see that here. On the left side, Moscow in 1300 is this blue area, not too much territory. 1400, it's getting much bigger. And then here, again, 1400 on the left, on the right, 1500, it's become a rapidly expanding kingdom at this time. And it will soon be the Russian Empire. And there's massive competition between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the emerging Muscovy or Russia. Okay, so let's do initial summary, a scorecard to this point. Who did Kiev and Ukraine belong to and when? So in its early history, Ukraine, or the area we know as Ukraine, had a largely East Slav population, but the Khazar kingdom, which was a majority state of Central Asian people, may have been the ones to actually build the city of Kiev. And then we get to the first major Eastern Slavic state of Kievan Rus, formed by East Slavs with Scandinavian Viking leadership. So you see there's actually a lot of mixing of peoples going on here. Once again, I'll emphasize that Kiev was older than Moscow, and it was a far more important city in Kievan Rus than was Moscow. After Kievan Rus fell, Ukraine came under Mongol rule, and that is when we had that state of Galicia, Volhynia, or Ruthenia, which was subsumed within the Mongol Empire. And then the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth took charge of Ukraine. So we see that for 1,000 years, from 600 to 1600, Ukraine was a land of many different political arrangements, but it was never ruled by Moscow until after the year 1650. And now we come to an interesting topic of the Cossacks. And here, this brings in the end of the Polish-Lithuanian control of Ukraine. And first, let me mention something that will be more significant later, which is that after the decline of the Mongol or Tatar Golden Horde in the late 1400s, the Tatars formed a state in Crimean Peninsula, and this was called the Tatar Khanate. In later history, it would be allied with the Ottoman Empire, and then it would be eventually conquered by the Russian Empire. Okay, so file that aside for now. East of Kiev, this new ethnic identity of the Cossacks develops. And who are the Cossacks? They're a rebellious warrior people in the Ukrainian area of mixed ethnic origins. In the middle of the 1600s, the Cossacks created a quasi-state called the Hetmanate. Hetman being a word like headman, their leader. So the Hetmanate is the land controlled by the Cossack headman. This was formed in central Ukraine, and it developed after a massive rebellion against Polish overlords who had been exploiting Ukrainian peasants. It was the first independent Ukrainian state since the time of Kievan Rus. Here's a portrait of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who led the anti-Polish uprising and then created the Cossack state, the Hetmanate, which would eventually form an alliance with Russia in 1654, sparking the 1654 to 1667 Russo-Polish Wars. When the wars ended, the Hetmanate, and thus Ukraine, was now part of Russia. And there's a darker side of this historical period to mention, the slaughter of Jews during the Khmelnytsky uprising. The uprising was not only directed against the Polish lords, but also at the Jews, who often worked as estate managers and tax collectors on the Polish estates. Jews were resented for serving the Poles, for being wealthier than Ukrainian peasants, and for being religiously different. Jews were attacked and slaughtered with great viciousness during this uprising, and what could only be described as a 17th century pogrom, if not an early Holocaust. Jewish chronicles of the time report that 300 Jewish communities were destroyed and as many as 100,000 Jews killed. And here's the way it's described in an account in the modern day Encyclopedia Judaica, a reliable source. It was during the months of May to November 1648 that most of the massacres took place. At the beginning of the uprising, the communities east of the Dnieper were immediately destroyed. Those Jews who did not manage to escape or join the Polish army of Wisniewski on its retreat westward met violent deaths. Some converted to Christianity to save their lives. Many were seized by the Tatars and sold into slavery. During the summer, the persecution spread to the western bank of the Dnieper, and by the middle of June, there were no more Jews in the villages. The overwhelming majority would be crowded into several fortified cities, which were also occupied by Polish garrisons. Even these, however, were unable to sustain the siege of the peasant hordes, and after the towns were taken, most of the Jews were butchered. However, fortunately, this was not the end of Jewish life in Ukraine. The Jewish community recovered. In the 19th century, one of the world's most famous Yiddish authors, Sholem Aleichem, his pen name, was born in Ukraine. He was even called the Jewish Mark Twain. His Tevi stories inspired Fiddler on the Roof, which I'm sure some of you must know. When he died, while visiting America on a literary tour in 1916, 100,000 people turned out for his funeral in New York City. On the upper right, a statue of Shalom Aleichem in Kiev, which I saw when I visited in 2015, where there's a museum dedicated to his life and work. And if you're interested, there is an excellent documentary made a few years back, Shalom Aleichem Laughing in the Darkness. I believe you can find it on Amazon or other streaming services. Bogdan Khmelnytsky is seen as one of Ukraine's founding fathers. And here we see a statue of him in Kiev. And there are many statues all around Kiev, very important figure, a great Cossack leader, founder of this independent state. But on the other side, we have this ugly episode of the slaughter of Jews in Ukraine. So let me explain why the Ukrainian Cossack state, the Hetmanate, was such an important turning point. First of all, it was the first independent Ukrainian state since Kievan Rus, and is often seen as the precursor to modern Ukraine. However, the independence was soon compromised by the decision to ally with Russia in 1654. The Cossacks may have thought the Russians were going to treat them better than the Poles and Lithuanians did, but they were wrong. Russia would progressively undermine the Hetmanate and eventually end its independence altogether. The final blow came under Catherine the Great, who also managed to destroy the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Interesting point. Prior to signing on with Russia, the Cossack leaders talked with the PLC about the possibility of the Hetmanate becoming a third equal partner, so that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth might have become the Polish-Lithuanian-Ukrainian Commonwealth. Today, we can see a new solidarity between Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine standing together against 21st century Russian aggression. The Cossack Hetmanate did something in the cultural sphere that would prove just as important as battlefield victories. It began the use of Ukrainian as a written language, not just a spoken one. This opened the way for Ukraine to develop its own distinctive literature, adding greatly to its sense of ethnic pride and national identity. Now let's move forward to the 18th and 19th century. After Catherine the Great snuffed out the last bits of Cossack independence, Ukraine became central to her ambitious plan to create something called Novorossiya, New Russia, which was an effort to colonize, conquer, and Russify lands all along the Black Sea heading south. The concept is in a sense similar to America's Western expansion, when settlers were encouraged to move west of the Mississippi and take over the lands of Native Americans. Novorossiya was planned to include Crimea, southern Ukraine, Moldova, and perhaps other lands to the south along the Black Sea. It was also known as the Greek project. And in the most extravagant version of this scheme, Russia would colonize and Russify, that is, promote Russian culture and language, in lands all along the Black Sea, all the way south to Constantinople or Istanbul, where she would put her grandson, who was named, coincidentally, Constantine, on the throne of a revived Byzantine, or rather Russo-Byzantine Empire. And remember, the Byzantine Empire and the Russian Empire shared these bonds of Orthodox Christianity and various forms of culture. Catherine actually met with the Austrian Emperor Joseph II in 1780 to seek his assistance in realizing this Greek project. So she was not joking, she was serious about this. The scheme never came to pass, but these two rulers would collaborate on another fun little project, the dismemberment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So here is a map that helps you understand Catherine's dream of Novorossiya. It was to include all the lands in yellow and these lands in pale green, heading south along the Black Sea. An interesting thing about this is that it seems to relate very much to what Vladimir Putin has been up to in the 21st century, because his conquests of Ukrainian territory largely match up with Novorossiya. And in fact, Putin has spoken fondly of the concept of Novorossiya. And there also, this is something I can't go into, there's a strip of Moldova that's been taken over by Russian separatist forces. So there's the question, is Putin trying to revive Novorossiya? Is he trying to walk in the footsteps of Catherine the Great? In the 19th century, nationalism, the idea of people living in the same country constituting a nation through sharing language, identity, and traditions, and thus deserving to have their own state and government, this new way of thinking swept across Europe, including into Ukraine. However, before any people could assert their right to a national state, they had to establish their national identity. Often the first step was literature. The first major Ukrainian literary work was Eneda by Ivan Kotlяревsky, who was a Cossack, and this was published in 1798. This was actually a parody of the Latin epic The Aeneid, written in Ukrainian and changing Greek heroes into Cossacks. Other Ukrainian authors like Taras Shevchenko and Ivan Franko would follow and become famous and important in the 19th century. A history of the Rus, written in this time, treated Ukrainians and Russians as equal partners in the ancient state of Kievan Rus. And so a new national literature and national consciousness have been born. And here you can see the three authors. On the left, Ivan Kotlяревsky, then Taras Shevchenko, and Ivan Franko. Shevchenko was also a painter, and here you can see an 1842 portrait of a female serf called Katerina. 19th century Russian authorities were fearful of rising nationalism in Ukraine, as well as in Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. And to cope with this, they turned to repression. Books were banned. Schools were closed. Native languages were forbidden. National identity was essentially criminalized. Even very important and useful institutions were shut down by Tsarist authorities if they were seen as being too pro-Ukrainian, such as the Kyiv Mohylia Academy, a school, later a university, that had been in operation since 1615. Instead, a new pro-Russian university was created, Kiev University. Well, that Russian repression doesn't always work out as planned. That seemingly pro-Russian university would soon be renamed the Taras Shevchenko, or I should say in recent times, it's been renamed the Taras Shevchenko National University, named after one of the most Ukrainian of authors. And Kiev Mohylia is still going strong. It's now the National University of Kiev Mohylia Academy. So Russian repression did not work out as planned. Let's hope Russian bombs do not finish the job, because one of the frightening possibilities in the current war is that historic and important buildings like this could be wiped off the map by Russian bombs and missiles. And then later in the 19th century, there was a massive anti-Russian uprising in Poland and Lithuania, followed by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. The response was increased repression throughout the Russian Empire. But there was also rising or there were rising underground resistance movements that were anti-Tsar and pro-independence in various states within the Russian Empire: Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Ukraine. Some of these were nationalist in orientation, some were socialist, some were anarchist, and others. After Russia's defeat by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 Russian Revolution nearly knocked the Tsar off his throne. Desperate to cling on to power, Tsar Nicholas II agreed to allow the different regions more freedom, allowing more printing and teaching in native languages and more open expression of national culture. Was the end of the empire approaching? World War I, like the war with Japan, exposed Russian weakness, caused great suffering for the Russian people, and helped lead to the Russian Revolution and the overthrow of the Tsarist Russian Empire in 1917. In this new situation of chaotic freedom, nationalist movements across the former Russian Empire rushed to create independent nations. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Poland succeeded in establishing independent states. Ukraine did not. It became part of the USSR, and Ukraine became a Soviet Socialist republic. But being named a republic did in fact constitute a partial recognition of its national identity. In the early 1920s, Soviet leaders allowed Ukraine and other regions some limited autonomy, respecting native languages and traditions. But this trend did not last. Soon it was back to repression, the Russian and now the Soviet norm. In the late 1920s, the Soviet policy of collectivizing farms met with stiff local resistance in Ukraine, where the rebellious spirit of the Cossacks was alive and well. As agricultural collectivization policy failed across the USSR, a scapegoat was needed, and Ukraine was it. In perhaps the most horrific episode, and that's saying a lot, in his 31 cruel years in power, Joseph Stalin created mass starvation in Ukraine by taking away almost all of the region's agricultural output, and Ukraine was often seen as the breadbasket of the Soviet Empire. And this left the Ukrainians to suffer and starve, and so they did. Millions perished from 1932 to 33 in what was a man-made famine conceived, ordered, and administered by Stalin. And on the right, you can see a Chicago newspaper from the time with horrific images, and likewise here on the left. So this is a very serious, painful moment in Ukrainian history that's honored each year. I had a chance to visit the Holodomor Museum in November of 2015, and here is a picture. It illustrates the pain, horror, and tragedy of the time. Peasants standing over a steer that has died from starvation. Even the animals are starving to death. There's no grain to feed them either. Outside the museum, there is now this monument in Kiev showing this starving girl, and you can see that here someone has put a sheaf of wheat into her arms. And here is a painful question for today. Will 2022 bring us Holodomor Volume 2? The current Russian invasion of Ukraine is also cutting off millions from food and other necessities. If Russian forces do not allow free passage to humanitarian efforts, and you may know, many convoys of trucks and aid trying to come into Ukrainian cities are being bombed and attacked by Russian missiles, just as people trying to flee are also being attacked. And so millions could starve in Ukraine today again. And furthermore, this time, there could be an international Holodomor. Ukrainian agriculture supplies low-cost grain to many poor countries in Africa and elsewhere. Without this grain, many people outside Ukraine will face rising food prices and even starvation. So Stalin only managed to make Ukraine starve, but Putin may be able to go much further. When we come to the period of World War II, we see that Ukraine had terrible options to either stay Soviet or to embrace the Nazis. And this is because when Germany invaded Ukraine in 1941, Ukraine was part of the USSR, so the people had to choose. Should they support and defend the Soviet state against the Nazis, or should they join up with the Nazis to fight against the Soviets? Not a very nice set of choices. And I would mention that other Eastern European countries faced the same terrible choice. And in each of these situations, including Ukraine, some people chose one side, some the other. They'd have good reasons for doing so because the Soviets were horrible and the Nazis were horrible. So choose your horror. Some who allied with Germany may have had real sympathies with Nazism. For others, it was their best hope to escape the regime that had given them the Holodomor. And let us speak a few words on the Holocaust in Ukraine. When Ukraine came under Nazi rule, the mass slaughter of Jews was carried out with horrific efficiency. In fact, 1/6 of all Jews killed in the Holocaust were Ukrainian Jews. At Babyn Yar, a wooded ravine near Kiev, 34,000 Jews were gunned down in 2 days. The site was also used for killing the Roma, that is the Gypsies, and other people. A distinctive feature of the Holocaust in Ukraine was the great effort that the German forces and their Ukrainian collaborators made to arrest and then execute Ukrainians who helped hide or assist Jews. Nonetheless, the state of Israel has honored 2,500 Ukrainians as righteous among the nations for their efforts to aid Jews during this period. At left, you see the monument at Babyn Yar, which I visited in 2015. On the right, a nearby area that was struck by Russian missiles just a couple of weeks ago, killing 5 and wounding 5. And here we see President Volodymyr Zelensky, who lost family members in the Holocaust, laying a wreath at Babyn Yar on September 29th, 2021, the 80th anniversary of the mass killings there. Putin absurdly claims that Zelensky is a Nazi and that the purpose of the invasion is to denazify Ukraine. Here's a tweet from Zelensky concerning the bombing of the area near Babyn Yar, and I'll let you read this for yourself. Zelensky, before taking office as president in 2019, visited the grave of his Jewish grandfather, Semyon Ivanovich Zelensky, who fought in the Soviet army against the Nazis. And 3 of his grandfather's brothers all died in the Holocaust. The war comes to an end, and Ukraine again becomes part of the USSR. This meant execution or Siberian labor camps for many Ukrainians who had sided with the Nazis. This only added to the deep bitterness of many Ukrainians. Soviet leaders always saw Ukraine as a potential trouble spot where there might be rebellion. And so, after Stalin's death, the new Soviet leader, Khrushchev, tried to plate Ukraine with a nice little present, Crimea. The Crimean Peninsula, south of Ukraine, west of Russia, strategic position on the Black Sea. Crimea had once been a Tatar state, became part of the Russian Empire after 1783, later the site of fierce battles during the Crimean War. Khrushchev gave Crimea to the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, and he did this as a political gift on the 300th anniversary of the Cossack alliance with Russia in 1654. And Crimea is an important area in a number of ways. It has both beautiful beaches, many people would go there for their summer vacations, and it also had Soviet military bases. The USSR did come to an end, and when it did, Ukraine became an independent country with 1/3 of the USSR's nuclear missiles. Ukraine's new leaders negotiated with Russia, and they agreed to give up the nuclear weapons to avoid conflict and prove peaceful intentions. An agreement was worked out, the so-called Budapest Memorandum, that Ukraine would give up its nukes, let Russia retain use of military bases on Crimea, and Russia would respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and borders. The agreement was signed by leaders of Russia, America, Britain, and last but not least, Ukraine. And here we see 3 of those who signed: President Clinton, President Yeltsin, and Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk. In the 1990s, Russia and Ukraine both struggled to become freer, more democratic, more normal nations. The old Soviet elite found ways to manipulate the situation to enrich themselves through massive corruption, and a new class of oligarchs emerged. Though both Ukraine and Russia made some real progress, after 2000, their paths radically diverged. Ukrainian people asserted a growing demand for greater democracy and less corruption, but Russia, under Vladimir Putin, slid backwards, losing civic freedoms and becoming increasingly dictatorial. So there was a great divergence, and I try to sum it up here. On the Russian side, Putin steadily led Russia away from democracy and toward autocracy, arresting enemies, co-opting oligarchs, taking control of news media, ending the direct election of regional governors, meaning that they would now be appointed by, guess who, Vladimir Putin, turning away from the 1990s cooperation to the EU and USA, and now moving toward hostility again, and creating turmoil in former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, to stop them from joining EU or NATO, because those alliances only allow people to join when their societies and governments are in good order. So if you can cripple the country through political turmoil or civil war, they can't join. And furthermore, Putin became dedicated to promoting the myth that Russia was the world's only hope against liberal Western decadence. However, high oil prices boosted the economy in the first decade of the 21st century, so most Russians were happy. Ukraine in this period, on a quite different path, much more democratic, had multiple leaders, not just one, like in Russia, frequent protests against corrupt politicians, competitive elections with pro-European politicians often going up against pro-Russian ones, and a geographical and political division, Western Ukraine tending to be more pro-European, Eastern Ukraine tending to be more pro-Russian. Then the 2005 Orange Revolution, pitting pro-Western leaders, or putting pro-Western leaders in power, but then pro-Russian leader Viktor Yanukovych becoming president in 2010 and putting pro-Western politicians in prison. So one of the important characteristics of this period is that in this first decade, there was an East-West identity crisis in Ukraine, and this would continue for some time to come. A very important turning point for Ukraine comes in 2014, the Maidan revolution and its aftermath. In 2010, the pro-Russian politician Viktor Yanukovych, running against the pro-Western or somewhat pro-Western Yulia Tymoshenko, was elected president of Ukraine. One of Yanukovych's top campaign advisors was Paul Manafort, who would later, coincidentally, work for Donald Trump. Once Yanukovych was in power, Tymoshenko was arrested and put in prison. In 2013, Yanukovych was in negotiations with both the EU and Russia, seeking closer relations with one or the other to improve Ukraine's economy. After Yanukovych indicated he was close to making a deal to bring Ukraine closer to the EU, to Europe, he changed course and signed an agreement creating closer ties with Russia. This infuriated Ukrainians because they felt they had been deceived. And beginning in December of 2013, there were massive anti-Yanukovych, pro-EU protests that erupted in Kiev, continuing into 2014. And incidentally, you might find it interesting that in the relationship between Yanukovych and his rival Tymoshenko, that when Yanukovych won his election, he immediately put her in prison. And I wonder, is this where the battle cry, "Lock her up," came from? Remember, Yanukovych's guy, Manafort, will soon work for, guess who? Donald Trump. So here is a map of Ukraine with the 12-star symbol of the EU superimposed, showing the hope of the pro-Maidan protesters. Protests centered on Maidan Square, hence the name Maidan Revolution. Yanukovych used brute force to try to beat down the protests, but they only grew. The protesters demanded Yanukovych resign. He responded with more brute force. Eventually, Parliament decided to impeach Yanukovych for killing Ukrainian citizens in his suppression of the protests. Yanukovych fled to Kharkiv in East Ukraine and then to Russia, showing where he was really welcome. Meanwhile, a transitional new government representing the Maidan Revolution took shape in Kiev, followed by new elections in June 2014. And here are some scenes from the Maidan Revolution. This is right in the center of Kyiv. It looks like some horrific war scene, and in fact, it was. Oh, I'm sorry, this is jump to the end. Let me go back. Sorry. Zoom tragedy. Okay, I want to show you more pictures of the Maidan Revolution. Okay, so here you see the massive number of people turning out. The woman is wrapped in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. The protesters drew up barricades to hold back the security force and soldiers that were turned against them. Massive crowds, musicians came out to perform to rally them. So here we see Ukrainians united in a way that we see again today. The Maidan protesters held their ground against brutality and death and worked together in amazing ways. They organized medical services for the wounded, hot tea, soup, and sandwiches for those on the front line, organized concerts and funerals for the dead. And ultimately, they prevailed. Against superior brute force, their superior moral courage came out on top. After Yanukovych fled from Ukraine into Russia, there was great interest in Yanukovych's ridiculously luxurious home, which showed the incredible wealth that corrupt leaders could amass in Ukraine. It has now been made into a museum of corruption. And here is something I'll have to skip over for lack of time, but again, to mention that a key advisor to Yanukovych was Paul Manafort, who would later work for Donald Trump. During the 2016 campaign, when Manafort was Trump's campaign manager, we began to see a curious pro-Russian shift in the Republican Party. And throughout Trump's presidency, he made many curiously pro-Putin and pro-Russian statements, while often being highly critical of Western leaders, like those of Canada, Germany, Britain, France, and even suggesting that America might leave the NATO alliance. Trump's admiration for Putin remains puzzling. Even very recently, he has praised Putin for his, quote, genius. So the Maidan revolution was triumphant. How did Russia respond? Well, one of its responses was to seize Crimea. And this is a complicated story. I can see I'm running out of time. I'll have to be very quick with this. What basically happened was there was a military base on Crimea where Russian troops were allowed to operate. Those troops began to fan out against Crimea. Meanwhile, pro-Russian protesters began to become a big presence in the capital. And I have to say, this reminds me of the January 6th insurrection in America. And then unidentified Russian-speaking soldiers appeared, and they became known in the Ukrainian and international media as little green men because they were wearing military fatigues, but without any identifying insignia on their uniforms. At the time, Putin denied that these were Russian agents, but later he admitted that they were. And we're not talking about this kind of cute little green men who for some reason seem to like to visit Kentucky. This is what we're talking about. Soldiers pouring in without identification, in violation of standard military procedures, and they soon took over Crimea. However, Russian media described them as very polite and charming, and I'll read you a bit from a Russian blog describing these wonderful little green men. These Russian military men do not look like Russian military men. I mean, they're definitely Russian and they're definitely military, but they belong to some completely new, different breed of people. They look smart, they look nice, they look fit. They do not harass women. They do not steal vegetables. For some reason, Putin said this is not Russian army. When I heard this, I felt offended because these men look so good and because every last Cretan on earth understands that of course this is Russian army. At the same time, if real Russian army actually looked this way, then I might even decide to join it. Soon the little green men take over the Crimean parliament. They install a pro-Russian prime minister. An arrangement is made to have a referendum giving Ukrainians in Crimea the choice to vote if they want to stay in Ukraine or join Russia. Russia sends in troops, and now not little green men, but regular troops. They arrive in large numbers in March. And then when the referendum happens, Crimea is under massive Russian occupation. So what's the result? 96% supposedly vote in favor of rejoining Russia. And all around the world, people reject this referendum because it's clearly being done under the threat of force. But there is one person who really likes this referendum, Vladimir Putin, who now announces that Crimea is officially part of Russia. After the annexation, the United States and other countries strongly protested the takeover. A vote in the United Nations denounced Russia. Russia was expelled from the G8, the group of 8 governments. The US and others placed stiff economic sanctions on Russia. Sound familiar? Result: Russia remains in control of Crimea today. All of those actions did not manage to dislodge the Russians. Russia did suffer economically under the sanctions, but Putin put the blame on the West. Oh, why are they doing this to us? And he actually gained popularity. And in fact, many Russians saw Crimea as a great Russian victory and increasingly viewed the West as an evil enemy with irrational hatred of their beloved Russia. And then less than 1 month later, Russia undertakes another intervention. It begins supporting a separatist movement in this part of Ukraine, where there is a large Russian-speaking population, and some of the local people are more inclined toward Russia. Russia promotes them. They take over the local government and they proclaim a breakaway pro-Russian republic. Now, most countries don't like regions of their territory breaking away. And this, in fact, leads to a kind of civil war. Ukrainian government sends forces to put down this secession, this separatist movement, and the separatists get support from Russia. And this leads to a slow grinding war that's continued to the present. And up to the present, an estimated 14,000 people have died. Once again, there were sanctions and international condemnations, but they have not stopped the killing. Do you start to see a pattern? As we face the mounting horrors of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, keep in mind that for Ukraine, this war did not start in February 2022. It started in April 2014. Ukraine has been fighting Russia for 8 years in the Donbas region, with 14,000, as I said, dead on both sides. This slow grinding war has, however, had an interesting effect. Before Russia's actions in Crimea and Donbas, Ukrainians were fairly evenly split on whether to form closer links with Russia or with Europe. But since 2014, and those actions by Russia in Crimea and Donbas, pro-EU, European Union sentiment has been steadily growing, even in the eastern areas closer to Russia, with ethnic Russian-speaking majorities who used to favor Russia over Europe. Not anymore. Today, we see Eastern Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv, a Russian majority city, fighting as hard against the Russians as anyone else in Ukraine. In a surprising twist that few could have foreseen, it seems that human beings do not like to be attacked, invaded, annexed, and killed. Strangely, they seem to prefer to associate with those who treat them with dignity and respect. Russian psychologists immediately denounced this finding as fake news. In this sense, Europe has already won in Ukraine. Russia can offer nothing that Ukrainians want. Putin may use brute force to flatten the entire country, but Ukrainians will only be hardened in their desire to join the EU and NATO. So now, let me attempt a summing up. You have hopefully seen by now that Ukraine has a long history with its own language, culture, and identity. It never has been a mere district or dialect of Russia. Often dominated by other states, Ukraine has long sought its own independent state. This was finally achieved in 1991, and Russia signed documents certifying Ukraine's independence and promising to protect it. Russia's annexation of Crimea and sponsoring of the separatist movement in Donbas are violations of agreements that the Russians themselves signed. The war in Ukraine is based on false historical narratives, broken international agreements, and naked aggression. The question we in America must now face is, what are we going to do about this? And now I'll give you my own thoughts on this, my own hopes and fears for the future. It is my hope that the USA, NATO, the EU, and other democracies and other bodies will not only support Ukraine with aid, but come to its defense. Some say we must not get involved militarily or it will mean World War III. My response to that is, if we do not defend democracy, we reward and encourage aggression and will only see more aggression in the future by Putin and others like him. It is my fear that the USA, NATO, and others will end the crisis in Ukraine by negotiations that reward Russia by allowing it to keep large chunks of Ukraine, such as perhaps Crimea and the Donbas, and by agreeing to Russia's demands that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO. This would condemn Ukraine to a Russia dominated future, which it obviously does not want. And let me address finally the nuclear boogeyman. There is much talk of the threat of nuclear war. Some say we must do any and everything to avoid that horrible possibility, even if it means letting Ukraine suffer death and destruction on a scale approaching the Holocaust. I think we are forgetting that nuclear war does not serve Russia's interests either. What does serve Russia very well is the threat of nuclear war. Let's not forget, Putin is a man of the KGB. He spent years studying how to coerce, how to threaten, how to intimidate and manipulate. Today, Putin may know that all he has to do is say nuclear, and many in the West will run and hide. This could be considered nuclear blackmail. And I ask you, if we back off and cower, Putin wins. And then we have to ask, what will come next? Where next? Might Poland be attacked? Perhaps the Baltics will be invaded. I believe we must stop Russian missiles to save Ukraine, because the destruction we see on the news day after day is from missiles raining down on Ukraine, and they have very few means to protect against them. It is risky to do this, but I would point out it's also risky not to do this, because appeasing monsters does not end well. And that is where I will stop. Thank you.
Good evening. Because of a technical glitch, our moderator, Professor Dr. Michael Quinn, was off the air for a while, but he will be taking your questions. He will moderate them. And if you have further questions, please send them to Michael Quinn. And I thank you very much.
Thanks, Dorothy. And thank you, Dr. Strmiska, for that very informative lecture on the historical perspective of the conflict in Ukraine. I don't know if you can turn your camera back on, Professor Strmiska, so that we can see you. As far as questions go, I think we'll give it a try to have people ask questions on their own. You can use the raise hand feature here on Zoom. If that proves untenable or unworkable, we'll resort to the chat afterward. Does that suit you?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's try that then. So if anybody has any particular questions, please use the raise hand feature. You can find it in the reactions button in the command bar. And before anybody else, I guess I'll ask a question of my own since I have the floor. I'm curious, you talked about your hopes and your fears for what's going to happen in Ukraine. Given your historical perspective, what do you think is actually going to happen?
I really can't say, because so many things are changing so quickly. The kind of sanctions we've put on Russia were unthinkable a month ago. And a lot of things that were unthinkable a couple of weeks ago are happening. For example, I remember a week ago on Facebook discussing with people options for providing military aid to Ukraine. And one of the topics that came up was drones, that there are types of drones that can almost function like fighter jets, and they could be used to take action against Russian troops, maybe even Russian military or missile bases. At the time, drones were out of the question. But guess what President Biden announced today? He's giving drones to Ukraine. And in fact, I have to say, it's encouraging. Today, the president announced a quite large package of military assistance of various technologies, some of which may actually help to defend against missiles, and I really hope so. So things are changing really fast. Well, let me give you two opposite scenarios, like sort of what I would consider best case and worst case. Best case would be that Ukraine gets to remain an independent country, regains its territory, the Donbass, the Crimea. Russia is so beaten down by its failure in the war and by the sanctions, which will increasingly take harsh effect as the weeks and months go on, that if we're lucky, maybe inside the Russian government or military, there could be a coup to overthrow Putin. And then maybe we'd have more reasonable Russian leaders who don't have this obsession with Russian empire. And I think Ukraine has so much potential for the future. I think we're even seeing it, through our news feeds and television reports, all these articulate Ukrainian people, so educated, so dynamic. This is a country that can do a lot, but it needs support, it needs help. So even in the best case scenario, let's say the war ended tomorrow, many of the major cities of Ukraine have been either close to completely destroyed or at least severely damaged. So Ukraine is going to have to rely on international support for years to come to rebuild, and that may be quite difficult. Now, worst case scenario would be that Russia continues bulldozing Ukraine. We in the West are unable to come together on a strong enough response to push Russia back. And in the end, we have to accept Russia taking over maybe not all of Ukraine, but a large amount of it. And that would mean Ukraine will remain a crippled, dysfunctional state where Russia has huge influence over its operations, and in fact, where Ukraine will be made to serve Russia's interests, not its own. Because as many analysts have said, the last thing Putin wants to see is for one of his fellow East Slavic states to become a successful Western democracy, because that would put Russia to shame and maybe cause Russians to be dissatisfied with Putin and the government, and to maybe stop believing the propaganda that Russia is the light of the world. So there really is there's a full spectrum of possibilities. This could go a number of different ways. And let me mention another point, though, that's very concerning. We've all been watching the flow of refugees out of Ukraine. This could actually cause political destabilization across Europe, because right now people in Poland or elsewhere are being very generous, taking refugees into their homes, into their buildings. They're using offices and schools, all kinds of space to put up these people. But how long can that go on? People are going to get tired of having all these refugees, and it's going to be extremely economically difficult. How are these people going to find work? How are they going to be fed? And the children speak Ukrainian. Are there going to be special schools for them? There are all kinds of issues, and this will put massive pressure on European societies and on politics. The last time we saw a major immigrant flow into Europe was 2015, and this had a number of disastrous effects in Europe. It caused many in Britain to turn against the European Union and led to Brexit, which has now caused Britain to be outside the European Union, which is causing many kinds of problems now actually for Britain and for Ireland. But that was something that Putin actively promoted. There were Russian agents in Britain that really took advantage that the British were freaked out by immigrants coming from all these other countries. And a lot of the pro-Brexit movement was an anti-immigrant movement. And there were also anti-immigrant politicians who came to power in Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, Czech Republic, other countries. Now, the Ukrainians are ethnically, and I hate to say it, racially more comfortable for most Europeans to deal with. But even so, if there are millions of new people in these countries, it's going to cause a lot of strains. And from past experience, we can expect that Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and Russian operatives or Russian-friendly agents in these countries will use that to drive a wedge in these societies and try to turn people against each other. So the refugees are a ticking time bomb. And in fact, I think the continuing flow of refugees is one of the factors that may push the Europeans to agree to stronger action against Ukraine. Because if the refugees keep flowing, it's going to be harder and harder and more difficult and more destructive and socially destructive for these European nations to take in millions of refugees. And you would notice the USA is not stepping up. I don't see any major effort on our side to bring in Ukrainian refugees. And part of this is because in the Trump era, regulations were put in place that make it almost impossible for people to become refugees in the USA. But I don't know of the Biden administration making much effort to undo those regulations and let refugees come. So there are so many dimensions to this. There's so many ways it could go wrong. But I guess to add a rare positive note to this rather grim discussion, let me say there really is a lot going right. We're seeing cooperation between European countries and the United States and other countries like Japan, Singapore, Australia, like we've never seen before. Russia is going to be so isolated in the future. However, that in itself is really dangerous. Like you may take some comfort, as do I, in the idea that this evil regime of Putin may be brought low by an economic hollowing out of that society. However, I got to remind everyone and myself, this doesn't always end well. When we think of World War II, Americans often think that from the American point of view, it started at Pearl Harbor. What a lot of people don't know is that before Pearl Harbor, America put massive sanctions on Japan to cut off its supply of oil, rubber, and other very necessary items. So we were thinking, well, we'll use sanctions to bring Japan to its knees. But in fact, the response of Japan was to attack America. So having a country devastated economically doesn't always produce a happy result. For example, another example, after World War I, Germany was punished for its aggression in World War I by having not sanctions, but having to pay reparations to other countries that basically crippled the German economy. Well, guess what that led to? Hitler and Nazism. Look at North Korea. There's a country been under sanctions for 70 years, or 60 years, I should say. But we don't see it turning in a more friendly direction. In fact, it's becoming more dangerous. So there are some hopeful signs, but there's a lot to worry about here.
Thank you. So we have a few questions here. We're going to start with Johanna. I'm going to ask you to unmute. David, you'll have to make sure that they can do that.
Yeah, they can.
Okay.
Hi.
Thanks.
Hi.
Can you show your
Can you hear me?
face? I like to see who I'm talking to if it's possible.
Oh, how do I do that? Start video.
There you go.
Okay, there.
Thank you.
Okay. So my question is much more historical and less contemporary political. I don't know if you really want to get into it. One of the things I thought was a little missing in your analysis of the origins of Ukrainian independence and so on was the role of Poland in the 20th century, controlling much of what's now Western Ukraine, and Lviv actually being a Polish city. And before that, in the time of my grandparents, Austria-Hungary controlling that whole section of Galicia and being German-speaking. And does that contribute, in your eyes, does that continue to contribute to a difference in attitudes between Eastern and Western Ukraine?
I could not include this because the lecture was already overstuffed, as you know. We
Right.
generally try to make these lectures 45 minutes, and I was almost a half hour longer than that. It's almost double what a lecture should be. But certainly, parts of Ukrainian territory that were controlled by Austria and Poland were in fact I would say, influenced strongly. And I think this does tend to, one of the reasons why the Western side of Ukraine is tended to be more pro-European. However, I do want to emphasize a point that I brought up toward the end, that over the last 10 years, and certainly the last 8 years, since the Crimean annexation and the conflict in Donbass, this East-West distinction in Ukraine is dissolving a bit, because even the people with more of a Russian identity who may use Russian as their primary language are not feeling so happy about Putin's Russia. And I know this kind of thing also from my experience in Latvia and Lithuania, where we have Russian minorities, Russian-speaking minorities who maybe use Russian as their primary language, who consider themselves ethnically Russian, but they don't want to go back to the USSR. They don't want to be invaded by Russia. They know they have a better life in the Baltic states or in Ukraine than they would in Russia. On the other hand, you do have some, particularly older people, who may be strongly influenced by Russian media, who may have a more pro-Russian point of view. But by and large, Ukraine has been moving in a more pro-Western, pro-EU direction. But you're quite right that there is complexity there, which I simply can't get into in a format like this.
Well, I just wanted to say also that it was my impression that Ukrainian nationalism and cultural identity was encouraged under the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a way that it was not in the Russian section, and that a lot of Ukrainian identity evolved in the late 19th century when Galicia was given considerable independence.
Right. So there were shifting degrees of repression or freedom in all these states. And I believe you're right that in that period, Ukrainian nationalists found a better base of support and less repression in the Austrian Empire of the time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. That's interesting
right.
information. Good to
That's
share.
right. Yeah.
Thank you, Johanna. So let's move on to the next question. I'll ask Peter to unmute and he can ask his question.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I see you?
Okay, yes, I'm trying to.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry, the lighting is bad.
That's
Thank
fine.
you so much. Thank you so much for such a great historical timeline. It's really important, I think, for Americans, for people in the Western world to understand a little bit more of the dynamics of the Ukrainian-Russian relations. You know, we often hear that, you know, that's big brother, little brother and all that. And, you know, to an extent, they were, but, you know, not by choice. So I think it's very important. One thing that I would ask you and everyone else in the media to make a distinction and not use interchangeably is Russian minority and Russian speaking majority. I notice you use that a little bit. Here in the West, you know, a lot of people use that. The media uses it. They used it to justify the quote unquote separatists in the Donbass region. So it is a fact that during the Holodomor, the Soviet government did repopulate sections of eastern Ukraine with Russian people. So that's why the eastern part of Ukraine became more Russian speaking. Kharkiv, the big city in eastern Ukraine that everybody has seen on the news being bombed over the last 2 weeks, happens to be the largest Russian-speaking city outside of the Russian Federation. However, you go there and you speak to people, they're proud Ukrainians. So, you know, many Ukrainians who are Russian-speaking are still Ukrainians and feel very strongly about being Ukrainians. So I just want to make sure that, we all are very careful in making that distinction between Russian people and Russian speaking.
Yeah,
But
I
again,
actually was
thank-
trying to do that, but it's easy to fall into these old patterns. So thank you for clarifying that. I wanted to include in my lecture, I don't know if I did, that very point that Kharkiv is often seen as like the biggest city with a large Russian-speaking population. But in fact, we see it being attacked, and we see the people there defending Ukraine against Russian invasion. So in terms of semantics and terminology and just labeling, I think we need some term like Russo-Ukrainian, to indicate that someone has Russian ethnic identity or ethnic background, but they identify as Ukrainian and they're fully happy to live in Ukraine. Just as in America, we have Irish Americans, Polish Americans, etc. But it is tricky, and I'm really glad you make that more clear for us. Thank you. And Peter, where were you coming from, or where are you located?
Oh, I'm in the middle town area.
Yeah,
I'm Jersey born, so
so you're you're a Jersey American.
I'm a Jersey American.
Okay.
A Jersey, a Jersey New Yorker.
I don't want people to think that your loyalties are only toward New Jersey, that you despise America. We have to be very careful about this. Thank you.
But thank you, Professor. I think that was really great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Next question we'll take from Vincent. I'll ask you to unmute and turn your camera on if you can.
Yes. First of all, thank you. And let me say thank you. I actually really did enjoy the lecture. So thank you for that. And I directly messaged you, Professor Strmiska. I do appreciate the information because I hear so much about what's going on. It's hard to distinguish if what I'm hearing is true and from reputable sources. So I had a conversation a couple of weeks back in my sociology class about what's going on in Ukraine when it first started. And my professor, she began to kind of question Putin's mental stability as of right now. And the other question that I believe it was me and another one of my fellow students brought up, once everything comes to light with this war that's going on in Russia, isn't it very possible that Putin will be charged with war crimes because of the bombing on innocent civilians?
Great questions. About Putin's sanity or lack thereof, I find this very interesting because I myself would not describe him as insane. I think he is motivated by an extreme ideology that we might consider crazy. But in the same way, like if you have a friend who joins some religious group that you find odd, your friend could still be quite normal, go to their job, cook pancakes in the morning, still able to flush a toilet and all that. But they have religious ideas you consider bizarre or extreme. So I think Putin is rational enough to be able to, execute plans and do things. But I think he is being guided by a very dangerous set of ideas. And along those lines, if you're interested, I mentioned I was interviewed on the WAMC show the other day, the noonday
Actually,
show.
I did hear about that as well. I wasn't able to catch it. I'm sorry to cut you off.
But let me mention, I brought up that there is a Russian political philosopher or political scientist named Alexander Dugin, who some call Putin's brain, who has a very complicated, well worked out, from my point of view, completely crazy view of Russia's place in the world, as Russia as the salvation of the world. It will save us from liberalism. It will save us from gay people. It will save Christianity. And when you look into that, it also helps to explain why some conservatives in America have also been attracted to Putin. And I think the magic sauce, or the secret sauce, is actually that Putin is one of the first political leaders in the last 15 years to really be anti-gay. And I think some people, sadly, really like that about Putin. So Putin in Russia put in place laws, I think it was 2009 or 2010, I'm not precisely sure, that were basically, the phrase was anti-gay propaganda. And the focus was to make sure that in schools, teachers could not teach anything positive about LGBTQ people. And you'll notice in America today, we have some states where the legislatures, and I hate to say it, but these are Republican majority legislatures, are passing similar
Yes,
laws.
we spoke about that
And also,
in sociology as well, but I'm sorry to cut you off again.
okay, but yeah. So I don't think he's crazy. I think he has dangerous ideas. Now about the war crimes, you know, the way you said it, in a way you answered your question, because you asked me, do I think he will be charged? Yeah, sure, he'll be charged. But who's going to go arrest him and bring him to trial?
That's
So,
that's another, very true fact in and of itself.
I mean,
Now,
unless he's overthrown.
yeah, yeah. So the other question I had, I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. So what is we've been hearing stories about the fact that he's hidden his family away. Is there any validity to those stories, or?
I don't know about that. He's never really over the years shown his family in public very much. He seems to keep that part very private. So I really couldn't comment on that.
Okay. No, this is
Thank
things
you,
I was
Vincent.
wondering.
I'm sorry,
No, no.
Vincent. We do have to move on and let other people have a chance to answer a question. Okay, thank you,
All right.
though. I appreciate
No
it. Next question from Jim Tarvin, please.
Thank you. Do you think it's likely that 50 years from now, people will look back and say Putin, with his aggression, actually enabled Ukraine to be forged into a much stronger, much more united nation?
If Ukraine survives, yes. I think it's already happening. There's no doubt. There's a spirit in Ukraine. The people are very much united, and they really don't want to be under Russian control. But an important distinction to make, and this kind of goes back to a discussion that Peter and I were having a couple minutes ago, we should be very clear to distinguish Russian culture and Russian people from the Russian government right now. And I've seen, and I'm sure you've also seen that in some place in the USA, people are Russian Americans, boycott their businesses. And I think we need to do a reality check on that, because these people do not support Putin. Well, maybe some of them do, but by and large, they probably don't. And we shouldn't assume that they do. And they are not responsible for the bombing and shelling of Mariupol and other places in Kiev. So I think in the current situation, we have to be careful to not give in to anti-Russian hysteria. Looking back, we know that in World War II, after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were treated terribly, put into basically concentration camps. As you may know, if you're a fan of George Takei, he's been a great educator on this point. So I just want to urge everyone to direct your anger toward Vladimir Putin and his government, but don't turn against all Russian people. And also, let us not abandon Russian culture. There is fantastic Russian culture. Some of the world's greatest literature and music came out of Russia, and I believe we should continue to value that. So it's good just to remember who deserves blame and who doesn't, and to not unfairly stereotype a whole vast group of people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Moving on to the next question from Jeffrey, please.
Hello. Um, Bringing up antecedents, you mentioned World War II. The precursor to Pearl Harbor was, I think you mentioned, was sanctions against the Japanese, which is fair enough. So what is the definition? Let's say the West is actually successful in getting Russia to leave Ukraine. What does that mean? Should we? I'm thinking of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. Do you stop at the Kuwaiti border? Do you go in and have regime change? Probably more accurately, what I'm trying to say is, should the Ukrainians or the West try to take back Crimea if they're successful in getting the Russians to retreat? Should they? What is the definition of success for, in your opinion, for the resistance to the invasion?
Well, in my view, the right result would be to repel Russia from all the areas that it has seized through force and illegally in the last 10 years. So that would mean expelling Russians from Donbass and Crimea. However, what I hear and see in the news, it sounds like the US State Department seem to be signaling they might be willing to signal for to settle for less than that. And I really am divided on this. It's a very difficult point, because if our priority is to stop the killing tomorrow, that kind of compromise with Russia, if it satisfied the Russian side, that could stop a lot of killing and death and destruction. But in the long run, on matter not only of principle, but practicality, if Russia is rewarded for its aggression by being allowed to keep territory, even after all this horrible suffering and destruction that it has unleashed, that is very, very problematic. So there's two different things there: immediately saving lives versus creating or maintaining a better international order for the future. Because if Putin is able to keep Ukrainian territory after what he has done, this could actually embolden other autocratic, aggressive leaders around the world to undertake their own expansionist efforts. And that could really undo what international order we have. Now you bring up change, meaning the overthrow of Putin. And I would love to see this, but it's hard to know how this could be done and what it would entail. It's very, very difficult. But on the other hand, how can we negotiate with a man who has lied and broken his word again and again, and who is, I would say, he could legitimately be called, although, you know, we like to say innocent until put on trial and proven guilty, I would say there's considerable reason to say he is a war criminal. Can we negotiate with such a person? What if Hitler in 1943 had said, you know what? Hey guys, I'm willing to negotiate. Yeah, you know, I caused all this destruction and killed all these people, but let's negotiate. Let's be reasonable. So I am divided on this issue. I can't give you a straight answer because I'm conflicted myself. On the one hand, I would like to see Ukraine keep its territory. I would like to see Russia repelled. On the other hand, a compromise giving up territory might save more lives in the short term. That's really, you know, like a Sophie's choice kind of dilemma.
Well, didn't this become an issue when Ukraine itself, not the, there is an argument about Crimea. If Khrushchev gave Crimea to the Ukrainians, why can't he take it back if it was his to give in the first place?
Well, first of
it
all,
seems like less central than the body itself.
Yeah, I know. I understand the argument, but on the other hand, if we respect international law, Russia signed agreements in the 1990s certifying that Crimea was Ukraine. So if international agreements mean anything, Crimea is Ukrainian. And I could only say it might make sense to give it up simply for the sake of peace and saving lives. But again, I worry about encouraging aggression in this way.
Thank
It's
you.
difficult.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was an excellent question. I see you put that in the chat as well. I do want to ask one question from the chat, and then we'll move on to another hand that's raised. It's an interesting question, and one you didn't address directly in your talk, obviously for interest of time, but that's the role of China in all of this, both in the conflict and in particular in the aftermath of any conflict. What role do you see China playing?
Well, I think currently China's trying to have it both ways. It has recently been getting closer to Russia, but it also wants to keep good relations with the West, at least for economic reasons. And you'll notice when a vote came up condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the United Nations, China did not vote no, it abstained, as did India. So I think even the countries like China that are somewhat sympathetic to Russia are not really happy about this invasion. However, another angle to bring into this, China may see an interesting opportunity here. With the rest of the world just about closing off to Russia economically, where can Russia go? It has to go to China to sell its oil in the long run, because Europe is going to progressively shut down its purchases of Russian oil, and we already have oil and gas. And this raises the issue of whether Xi Jinping might be thinking to himself, you know what, this could really work out nicely, because with Russia having shot itself in the foot like this and now being cut off from the West, I can start to make Russia my, well, I won't use a rude word, but my vassal, let's say. And interestingly, in the long range of history, if we think back to the early centuries of Russia, Russia or Muscovy first developed by breaking free of the Mongol Tatar Empire. Well, here we might see Russia returning to become a vassal of today's major East Asian empire. But I think you're right that China's role will be decisive. I think China's kind of sitting on the fence now, waiting to see which way the wind blows. But I think if Russia really starts collapsing, and also if Russia continues such horrific activities, I suspect China might start tilting more toward the West, but not in some really direct, explicit way. But it might just become more quiet about the situation and be carrying less water for Russia. But it will act in its interests. It can currently get a lot of benefit out of increased Russian dependence on China. So I think from China's point of view, if Russia destroys itself, it's almost in their interest. And if Russia survives in some form, it will be dependent on China. So that's great for China. So that's all I can say about that.
Okay. Another question from Alexandra. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
I'm sorry, I don't look like Alexandra. Michael, thank you very much for putting this on.
I'm right here.
It was very informative, and I imagine your friends in Lithuania and Latvia must be grateful for you doing this also, because I imagine they've got to be very, very concerned. It just seems like yesterday that the tanks were in Vilnius and all that. So what do you think that those of us here can do to help Ukraine on our individual levels, to help change what's happening? I see a lot of dissension. There's a Ukrainian member of the Congress that was sort of lambasting the president earlier today, for example, and that's not going to help us. We were successful in World War II when we kind of came together.
Well, actually, I might disagree with you there because I think politicians respond to pressure. And we do see the administration and the politicians, both Democratic and Republican in general, day by day, week by week, they do seem to becoming more receptive to taking more action to help Ukraine. So in that respect, I think the pressure, even if it is a little impolite and painful, can be productive. Because think of it, what if that lawmaker were just sitting back and saying, Joe Biden's a nice guy, I don't want to criticize him. I mean, what good would that do in this situation? But as far as what people can do, I think it's obviously two things. There are many, many great organizations like Save the Children, for example. I mean, there's so many. You just do a search online, you can find organizations that are sending aid to Ukraine. And something I would discourage people from doing, I think in this area, when there is a crisis needing charity, people really love doing things like donating clothes and canned food and all that. That is not efficient. It's much better to send money, and then over there they can buy what they need in large quantities instead of having to sort out, used mittens and, cans of corned beef hash or something. So send money to organizations, and if you can, make it a recurring contribution. They're going to need money for a long time. Rebuilding is going to be very tough, even if we get through the worst of this war. The other thing is keep calling and writing to your political representatives in the House, in the Senate, the governor, the president. They do respond to pressure. If they get a huge number of letters or phone calls urging them to do something, even if they don't want to do it, they might feel some pressure to at least go part way. So political pressure, we are a democratic country. People sometimes, I think, have doubts, how democratic are we really? Does the system really work? But to this extent, politicians do respond to pressure. So contact your representatives, and there are different points of view what should be done for Ukraine. Like in my case, I've called my representatives and said, please take more action, provide more military support. I was in favor of a no-fly zone, as President Zelensky was today in his very moving address to the Congress this morning. But whether it's no-fly zone or something else, just more support. So I would say urge them to do more and provide more support. So those two things: give to organizations and speak out to your political representatives.
Thank you again very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Next question is from Salix.
Hi. I just want to say I appreciate you bringing up the link between World War II and like how that resulted from how Germany was treated in World War I. Because I feel like when we talk about saying Russia does this and that, etc. Sorry, my daughter's here.
Do not appease that little monster. They'll only grow more forceful and aggressive. So I'm telling you.
I feel like we forget there's real individual people being affected by this. I just hope that whatever happens, Russia is not treated like Germany was, because I think it would result in very similar extremism and just more conflict.
That's a very interesting issue, because we were talking before about, is Putin a war criminal? And war criminals should be put on trial and punished. But there's the problem of, should the entire Russian people be punished? And that is a difficulty of the sanctions. Sanctions often affect ordinary and poor people more than they affect elites and leaders. However, these current sanctions are being crafted in a way to really target the upper level elites of Russian society. And a lot of the wealthy Russians, the oligarchs and such, they've enjoyed this lifestyle for 10, 20 years where they buy apartments in New York City, in London, and they fly around the world and they enjoy their yachts and they have a super luxurious lifestyle. Suddenly, billions of their dollars are frozen. They cannot access their foreign accounts. So there is hope that maybe this will bring those people to organize against Putin. But it's not a certain thing, though. Many analysts say Putin, he's been in power a long time. He's a KGB guy. He knows how to manipulate people. He knows how to create webs of dependency and deceit. And it will not be easy to dislodge him. But, Mussolini got it in the end. It could happen to Putin. But I take your point, though, Salix, that we also have to worry what will happen to Russia in the future. If we reduce Russia to an extremely terrible state, it could actually backfire, because we have seen the capability of Putin to use propaganda to say, oh, my Russian people, those evil Westerners, they're doing this. They're making us poor. They're making your life hard. I want to give you a beautiful life. But those horrible Americans and those Europeans, they hate Russia. They hate you. Let's make Russia great again. Come with me. And that has worked for Putin. Will it work in the long term? And then, another interesting point about Russia to discuss is, as in many countries, there's really a division between the rural areas and the big cities. This is, kind of automatic and almost, it's something you can take for granted in any society. There's always a rural-urban division. And it's been very encouraging and frankly amazing to see how many Russians in the big cities have been protesting against the war. Because in the current state in Russia, if you speak up against the government, you can end up in prison for a very, very long time. And I don't think the Russian prisons are very comfortable. And I'm sure many of you saw that clip in the last couple of days on that Russian news broadcast where that very brave woman came out in view of the camera holding up the sign saying against the war and saying you're being told lies. Well, that woman, I saw an interview with her this morning, maybe some of you have also, she now fears for her life, and with good reason, because that's how Russia is. So in other words, these people who went out to protest, they are risking their effing lives to speak out. It requires great courage, and they really deserve a lot of credit and support. However, these are people in the big cities. Out in the poorer rural areas, a lot of the information, a lot of them may get their main information from the state-run TV, which gives a pro-Putin message 24/7, anti-Western message 24/7. So there are many Russians who, from our point of view, might seem like they're brainwashed. But, in our own country, we see the divisions that happen from people inhabiting different information universes. And in Russia, there is one information sphere that's really dominant. And in fact, so many of the things we talk about have two sides to them, and a brighter side, a darker side. And one thing about all these international companies cutting off their services to Russia, it may also limit Russians' ability to get any information outside of the Kremlin information bubble. So many complexities to consider. But thank you for that question, Salix. That's very good. Very important.
Thank you. A couple of comments are made in the chat, and they're just coming directly to me, so they're not visible to anybody else. But let me kind of summarize a theme that maybe you want to comment on. You did touch on this in your talk as well, the problem of refugees and migration. A couple of different people have commented about how this seems to be a dominant feature of this conflict, as it seems many recent conflicts have generated this kind of problem. I guess the question, if we want to turn it into a question, is do you think that it is possible that the humanitarian crisis of refugees and migration, not just in Ukraine, but even possibly Russia, given the level, the severity of sanctions, could overwhelm the actual conflict itself, become more important than the conflict itself?
Well, I wouldn't want to pit one against the other, but I would say certainly it's going to become a larger and larger issue. And let me mention something else that a lot of people here may not be aware of. You know, next to Ukraine and Russia is Belarus. It's the third major East Slavic nation. And Belarus has a dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, who is very close to Putin. A couple years ago, summer of 2020, there was an election in Belarus. And like in Russia, the results of the elections are pretty much predictable in advance. Obviously, Lukashenko would win re-election, but a lot of people were interested in voting against him. So Lukashenko intimidated and arrested other political candidates. And one of them was a man who he had put away. And I'm forgetting the name offhand, I'm sorry. But his wife took up the mantle, and then she won a much larger share of the votes than was expected. And in fact, some people think she might even have won the election. There's no way of knowing because it's a very secretive, corrupt state. And clearly Lukashenko's people would make sure that he won. But then there were massive protests in Belarus in the summer and fall of 2020. And at the time I was living in Latvia, and in Latvia, we had a lot of pro-Belarusian activity at that time. So I was very conscious of this, and it was kind of like what we see in Ukraine today. It was so encouraging to see in Belarus so many people, particularly young people, who were coming out, risking their lives to protest, and they came out in huge numbers against Lukashenko. But unfortunately, as fall turned to winter, Lukashenko, with support from Russia, from Putin, became increasingly brutal in his suppression of the protesters, and more people were taken away, put in prisons, beaten and abused, and the protests were eventually crushed. There are now no more protests in Belarus. The repression was successful. But then in the last year, Lukashenko found a way to punish the countries that had supported the protesters. He invited people from the Middle East who were fleeing conflict zones like Syria to come to Belarus. And then the Belarusian authorities encouraged the people to cross the border into Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. And pretty soon those countries had a huge immigration crisis because these people were coming in who they didn't know what to do with. And the point of view of the Baltic states and Poland is that Lukashenko had basically weaponized refugees, using them against his neighbors to express his displeasure and basically, give them a punch in the mouth in this way. So it's not impossible that Russia right now is actually taking great pleasure in seeing the flow of refugees, because it's a way of damaging and battering the Western countries that support an independent Ukraine. So refugees are a very, very difficult issue. And I would remind again, historical parallel. In World War II and leading up to World War II, many Jews in Europe were desperately trying to flee, and many countries would not take them, including the United States. We turned away many people. Some of them ended up going back to Europe and ending up dead in the Holocaust. So coping with refugees is a real test of a country's fortitude and character. And frankly, sadly, history shows us that countries often cannot deal with this issue very well. So I agree, the refugee issue is going to be very, very big.
Thank you. Another question from Nathan, if you want to unmute.
Okay, turn on. Okay, it did. Yay. Okay, so a lot of like what's happening right now with Russia and the entire Ukrainian conflict, a lot of it just kind of seems like the continuing cascade effect of the fall of the Soviet Union. Because like effectively overnight, you see the entire apparatus of a state collapse, and I think we're still seeing the fallout of that. Because I think, you know, Putin is quest to kind of like bring back this empire together, and you know, the Soviet like crackdowns in Belarus are all just seem to be echoes of this, you know, not totally dead Soviet Union. And I think this is also just a repercussion of the West not really doing much to rehabilitate Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union as well.
Well, let me differ with you a little bit on that. But first, let me go back. I think you're quite right. This all has to do with, you know, post-Soviet Eastern Europe. But remember, in my lecture, I emphasized that Ukraine and Russia have been on different paths. In the 1990s, under Yeltsin, Russia was becoming a more open society. And one of the indications was they opened up the archives of the KGB. You know, the most embarrassing, disgusting stuff about the Soviet Union, this was opened up. People could explore that past. And they did discuss and analyze the terrible things that were done by the KGB and the Soviet government. But in the case of Russia, after Putin came to power, all that began to close down again. But not so in Ukraine. Ukraine has remained on this path toward becoming more open, more liberal in the classic sense of the term, more democratic. And it's been a very turbulent thing. I mean, Ukraine's had 2 revolutions in 20 years. You know, that most countries, you know, 1 revolution per century is quite enough. They had 2 in 10 years. That's pretty amazing. And out of this turbulence, we really do see, as someone was saying earlier, that this period has been kind of a crucible for the forging of a modern, open, democratic Ukraine. But Russia is shifting back, although I would say it is not shifting back to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had an ideology. They did believe in some version of communism. And even if it may have been very hypocritical and maybe very cynical, there was a belief there, some idea of creating a better society. Under Putin, there is no such thing. Only thing he offers people is some sense that they might have a little bit better lifestyle economically. And then he offers this extreme nationalism. And again, I would mention the man called Putin's brain, Alexander Dugin. It's an extreme right-wing vision of the great Russian nation. And that kind of thing, you know, can be very satisfying to people. Remember, a lot of people loved Nazism. In fact, we had people in America who loved Nazism in the 1930s before the war came. So there is a divergence there.
Belarus
Well, it also reminds me a lot of facets of Stalinism as well, like specifically the flavor of communism that existed during World War II and directly afterwards.
Except that Stalin wanted to create a centralized state that would be developing. Under Stalin, a lot of things did develop. A lot of industry developed, a lot of housing was built, the military was built up. In Putin's case, it's more of a gangster aristocracy of all these people just looking out to pad their own pockets. So there has been progress on the military side. They have upgraded their military, although current performance in Ukraine is kind of underwhelming. Although frankly, I don't know. I'm thinking it maybe the reason is partially just a morale issue. The young soldiers being sent into Ukraine from Russia were not informed in advance of what it was all about. Many of them were told, we're just going on a routine patrol, and then suddenly they're trying to take Ukrainian cities. And many of them may just be feeling, you know what? I did not sign up for this. But Nathan, to go back to your point though, Putin is a Stalin fan. And I think what he likes best about Stalin is that obviously Stalin was a very effective, repressive autocrat who everyone was afraid of. And I think that looks pretty good to Putin.
Yeah, that and their fixation on hypermasculinity.
Well, that's an interesting point. I was reading an article about this curious phenomenon in American politics that some in the Republican Party on the right wing side of our political spectrum have in the last 10, 15 years become fans of Putin. And we can go back and find, speeches and articles by people like, say, Pat Buchanan praising Putin as being gee, he's a tough guy. Why can't we have someone like that? And a lot of people really liked that, from my point of view, very silly macho posturing that Putin engaged in, where he'd be photographed, riding a horse, bare-chested. They'd show him wrestling. They'd show him going into the ocean, deep sea diving, like, Putin, the master of all sports, the king of all martial arts. And it turns out a lot of people like that. And I forget who made the contrast, but I saw some conservative author or commentator who contrasted how he thought Obama was kind of effeminate because Obama was very well spoken and very polite and restrained. And wouldn't it be great to have a really rough, tough guy like Putin? Well, you know who came along. I will say no more.
All right. Thank you, Professor. Sorry, Doctor.
No, thank you. Very thoughtful comments.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Professor Strmiska, for a wonderful and very informative lecture and discussion afterward. There are no further questions in the chat, and there are no more questions here on Zoom. So I think that wraps it up.
Well, thank you all for coming. I enjoyed doing this for you, and I thought it was a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Absolutely agreed. Thank you very much, Michael Strmiska. We appreciate it. And thank you, Michael Quinn, for moderating.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.